Welcome to Futurism, Fatalism, and Climate Fiction. I'm Michael Berry, and I've covered science fiction and fantasy for the Chronicle for a number of years. With me are four panelists invited to discuss how fiction about the future can address such issues as rising seas, droughts, pandemics, social unrest or collapse, and other possible consequences of climate change, as well as perhaps imagine more optimistic scenarios in which those challenges might be overcome. Before we begin, I'd like to remind you to please turn off your cell phones and urge you to buy books and have books signed by the authors at a booth out across Alston Way. I'd like to acknowledge the sponsorship. It's sponsored partly by the Finlandia Foundation National and the Barbro Osher Pro Suecia Foundation. Also, today's program will be filmed by 4TV so that you or your friends can watch it online later. With me are Antti Tuomainen. He's the award-winning author of 5 novels, A Killer I Wish, My Brother's Keeper, The Healer, Dark is My Heart, and his latest, The Mine, to be published in Finland in August. He has been called the King of Helsinki Noir by the Finnish press, and his writing has garnered attention nationwide. In 2011, The Healer was awarded the Clue Award for Best Finnish Crime Novel and has subsequently been published in 27 countries. The Healer follows a desperate husband as he traverses a devastated, rain-drenched Helsinki in pursuit of his missing wife, a journalist tracking a serial killer. Edan Lepucki's debut novel, California, was published by Little Brown in July of last year. The novel debuted at number 3 on the New York Times bestseller list, has been a number 1 bestseller on the Los Angeles Times and San Francisco Chronicle lists, and was a fall 2014 selection of Barnes & Noble's Discover Great New Writers program. Edan's California, a post-apocalyptic domestic drama, follows a young couple as they attempt to survive in the state's northern wilderness after civilization has collapsed in Los Angeles and other points south. John Scalzi is a science fiction author, online writer, and former president of the Science Fiction and Fantasy Writers of America. He's best known for his Old Man's War series, 3 novels of which have been nominated for the Hugo Award, and for his blog, Whatever. He won the Hugo Award for Best Fan Writer in 2008, and his novel Red Shirts won the 2013 Hugo Award. John's novels Lock-In, Ghost Brigades, and Red Shirts are all currently in development for television. Lock-In is a near-future thriller set in the aftermath of a pandemic that has killed a large portion of the population and left many of the survivors permanently paralyzed. Paolo Bacigalupi, his debut novel, The Wind-Up Girl, was named by Time magazine as one of the 10 best novels of 2009. It also won the Hugo, Nebula, and the Locus Awards. Paolo's short fiction has been nominated for 3 Nebula Awards, 4 Hugo Awards, and won the Theodore Sturgeon Memorial Award. Paolo's debut young adult novel, Shipbreaker, was a Michael L. Prince Award winner and a National Book Award finalist. His other books for young readers include The Drowned City, Zombie Baseball Beatdown, and The Doubt Factory. Paolo's latest novel for adults is The Water Knife, a near-future thriller about climate change and drought in the southwestern United States, where hired guns will go to almost any extreme to keep the fountains of Las Vegas filled. So I'd like to kind of start things out just by having each of the panelists talk a little bit about works of fiction, or whether it be science fiction or environment-based literature that has strongly affected them as a reader and a writer, and how one of their books reflects that influence of how we're being affected by climate change. So, Antti?
Since I'm from Finland and Finnish is my native tongue, I apologize for speaking English now. Well, I don't apologize for speaking English. I apologize for my English. Anyway, actually I was trying to think of writers that you would know, since many of the writers who influenced me greatly were obviously Finnish writers, and they haven't been translated, and even if they were, you wouldn't know about them. And especially if I talk about like science fiction or dystopian influences, I would have to start with films that I saw when I was very young. Blade Runner, and the first Planet of Apes. I think the final scene where you see, is it Statue of Liberty buried in sand?
Damn you! You know it's a hell.
Exactly. I remember I was very small. I was in Finland, and I realized that something terrible has happened, and it was somehow very fascinating. That was a very fascinating, and that must have influenced me greatly because I remembered that. But there have been writers, of course, French writers who are very dark and doomed and gloomy, who probably influenced me a lot. And there's, of course, Cormac McCarthy's The Road, but that came later and has been a later influence. But the profound influence probably, and I'll try to keep this short, probably was the final scene of Planet of the Apes. Thank you.
Hi. I was actually extremely nervous to be on the science fiction panel and had thought I'll just crawl under the table when we start talking about science fiction, because I am not particularly well read in the genre. But after I wrote California, I sort of was like, well, why did I write this book? Who am I to write such a book? But then I was like, Edan, The Handmaid's Tale by I talked to myself. Edan, The Handmaid's Tale by Margaret Atwood is your favorite book. And so I read that about 5 times in college, and then I taught it a couple times in graduate school. And so I suppose there was always a kind of speculative dystopian novel in my future. And I love the Mad Adam trilogy as well for Atwood. And thinking about this question in my own book, my book has quite a lot about the past and where my young married couple were before they came to live by themselves. And that's sort of how Mad Adam works as well. It really relies on exposition, provides a lot of the drama of, well, how did this guy get to be alone with this weird multicolored tribe of people? And Handmaid's Tale as well constantly reverts back to the past, with Offred thinking about how she came to be living in the commander's house. And of course that book is also so much about women in the future and the fate of women, and that's also in my book. So I think a lot of Margaret Atwood's work, both her realism and her more traditional science fiction, deals with the topics that I'm interested in.
I'm going to agree that a lot of when I think about dystopia and stuff, a lot of it actually comes from cinema rather than from books per se. Part of that is because, I was a film critic for a long time, and but part of it is also there was this run from 1968, starting with Planet of the Apes in 2001, moving into 1976, where you just had these magnificently depressing science fiction films. So you had Planet of the Apes, you had Soylent Green, you had Mega Man, you had Logan's Run, which was both, chintzy and depressing. So a lot of that, my sensibility from that comes from cinema. I've been actually, in terms of books and books that have been influential in sort of the way that I think about climate in the future and stuff, I just happen to actually have the book with me. Ursula Le Guin's Always Coming Home, which is not a dystopia, but is a speculation about a future that might have been or would have happened. So, and there's an inland sea in California, and there's a whole new culture and how they sort of adapt from that. And I've loved this book for years and years. I started reading it when I was 13, and part of it is because not only is it a story of a particular woman named Stone telling and how she lives her life on a day-to-day basis, but it is, in some ways, it's just a world-building thing where she explains how the culture works, how the society functions, and as someone who has, loved D&D and world building. This was just an amazing way to look at a future that could have been. So in many ways, I don't know that it shows in a lot of my writing, but certainly when I think about future world building, I often think about Ursula Le Guin.
So actually, most of my influences for my fiction writing are actually nonfiction books and writers. When I was working on The Water Knife, which is my latest one, and it's all about drought and this mega drought in the Southwest United States. It's all about water, weirdly. Yes, please. The people who actually, first influenced my thinking and about these things were actually science journalists. So they were people like Matt Jenkins and Michelle Nijhuis, who I worked with when I was working at High Country News, which is an environmental newspaper that covers the Western United States and its resource issues. People like Elizabeth Kolbert, who writes for The New Yorker. Those people had a profound influence. But in terms of specifically with the water knife, Mark Reisner's Cadillac Desert was a huge influence for me. He has this amazing book about, sort of the hubris of our engineered water systems in deserts and, the big eras of dam building and water pumping and canals and, the idea that we can make the desert bloom and how we went about doing that. It's just a fabulous book. And it sort of provided a huge basis for me when I was thinking about the water knife, when I was thinking about how does these systems break. But the other one that actually really struck me was there's a reporter named Charles Bowden. He passed away recently, but he wrote a book called Murder City, which is all about Ciudad Juarez, just as the narco murders were really skyrocketing. And it was, Juarez had always been a bad place. It was like, running around 300 murders a year. And then one year, suddenly they hit 300 murders in the first month, and they kept going up and up and up. And his documentation of those murders and all of the ways that the city was sort of tearing itself apart in these strange ways really influenced me in terms of thinking about a society that still exists, has many functional services, and yet is also ripping itself to pieces. And both of those were really deeply influential.
Thank you. So what do you have to say about the educational value of futuristic fiction? Can speculative fiction be a useful tool in thinking about or even preparing for the future? Did you think about these issues in the process of writing your book?
Who are you asking?
I'm going to ask Antti to kind of move down the row again.
Educational is, well, I think it's, for me personally, it's a big word for well, I'll keep it simple from my personal perspective. Books changed my life. Books made me the person I am today. Books made me want to write books. So I do believe in books, and if there's any educational value, or if there's any that it teaches you something, I think it starts with the one lone reader somewhere. You're reaching him or her. So in that way, they might have some value as building a better society or changing the world for the better. But it's always, I think it's always a matter of individual response to that. So I really, to answer the question, I don't know. But books changed my life. I think they can change, anybody else's life too.
I agree with that. I definitely don't start out my fiction, I'm like, time to educate the reader. I just feel like that's a really easy way to be didactic and to make things really neat, when in fact I think humans are really particularly thorny, complex, messy, muddy creature, right? Like, why do we do the things we do? God. When you did something really bad, there's probably 6 different reasons why you did that. And I think that's what's so interesting about being a human and what makes reading so wonderful. So I don't ever set out to teach anybody anything, but I do believe that reading requires empathy for the reader to empathize with the characters, and that in fact is educational, to just share a consciousness with someone else. And I didn't set out to make people make certain decisions about where we were going in the future. This is definitely the future that we're going to have, but it is a great compliment when somebody says, I finished your book and it really freaked me out. And when I thought, this is maybe my last shower. And I was like, that's an important moment to recognize what we have in the present. Not that I don't know if that changes anyone's actions, but I do think it is relevant and it is important. But I didn't set out to educate people. I just wanted to move people, I guess.
Cherish every hand sanitizer. Yeah. I also believe that there's a real problem with, getting onto the thing is, and today I will educate you all. Because I do think that, quite frankly, quite a lot of times if you say, now I'm going to teach you something, that's like, well, you didn't teach me anything. And in fact, I have a lot of things that I've read right here on the internet that tell me that you're wrong. And so there can be a lot of problems with that. The first thing that, I try to do is, one, write an entertaining story, which sounds, just like any hack would tell you, but is actually the truth. Because if I'm going to be talking about things like, for example, transmission of a disease that wipes out, 500 million people and paralyzes 50 million or something like that, I better make sure that you actually enjoy reading about it, because otherwise you're going to be so damn depressed, you're not going to get out of the first chapter. But the other thing is that I find really useful to do. Obviously, I have an editorial point of view, because I'm a human, and all humans have an editorial point of view. But I think what is more interesting for me is a lot of times just to create the world, make an awareness of the consequences of the world that exists, and don't make people choose one way or another, but just allow them to think about it and what it means for them. And there are going to be a lot of people who will see the path that you suspect that they will walk down and recognize it and go, okay, that makes sense to me. There are a lot of people who are going to make these weird detours, and you'll be like, wow, I didn't know where that came from, but your brain, sir, is unique and you should cherish it. So you've got lots of different ways that they can do it. But quite frankly, you put all the elements there. Quite frankly, I think most everybody at this table, we assume that our raters are smart, and that if you, I know I'm optimistic, but if you put the stuff there. That was, even after they close the book, they're still going to be thinking about it. And if they're thinking about it after they've turned that last page, then you've won.
All right. So I think that you guys touched on some interesting things. Yeah, there is this danger in didacticism. Yeah, you definitely want to entertain first. That's the first connection. That's the reason why you write. That's the reason why we read. If we aren't entertained and engaged, why the hell would you pick up a book in the first place? And so I think that there's a deep responsibility for that. That said, I am absolutely all about education, and I absolutely have an agenda. Yeah, I know, it's not weird. I know, it's like literally every single book starts with agenda with a capital A. So, and then I try to hide that, but it's. I try to hide it with entertainment. I mean, I try to hide it with interesting, engaging characters who are multi-layered inside of interesting conflicts. But one of the things that's really interesting to me about when I choose a book to work on, it has to have some purpose in my mind. There has to be some reason for me to sit in this room working on this book for the next 2 years. And that boils down very much to the idea of education in a lot of ways. So when I'm writing about something like climate change and massive droughts and changes and impacts on society and things like that, the reason I'm writing about that is because, wow, it seems like we're still caught in this really weird dialogue about things like climate change. Is particularly in the United States, we seem to be in reality free fall about what data means and what science means and how it works and things like that. This frustrates me. But one of the things that's really interesting to me is it seems like we're in a space where literally like the information cannot transfer between, say, one party and another, one set of ideologies and another. You can't have useful conversation based on what we would call facts in reality land and, hogwash in, I don't know, religious psycho land. But the thing that's really fascinating to me is that fiction, I think, does have this opportunity to create empathy. It has this opportunity to create connection. And particularly science fiction is really interesting to me because it allows us to live in the skin, not just of people who are different from us, but inside of the skin of our future selves, inside of the skin of our children. One of the things that's really interesting to me about people is that when we go around in our day-to-day lives, we emphasize the value of what we're doing today because we, inside of our own skins here today, only experience the value of that. We don't recognize that there are costs that we're inflicting on our future selves or on our children or whatever. So I feel like there's an opportunity in science fiction to, if you put somebody out in the space of living as a climate refugee in the future, that can create empathy and connection with a conceptual thing that before was too abstract to connect to. And I think that that's a real power of fiction, and science fiction particularly, and it's something that I'm really interested in because it's sort of an opportunity to get past the whole, well, my facts say this, and your climate scientists clearly are corrupt, and all that kind of stuff. And just say, well, how does it feel to live in this future? Do we want it? Do you want to be anywhere close to it? Can you connect to these people? Do you connect to the idea that your children might have to live in that sort of space? And that's an emotional connection rather than an intellectual argument.
Well, and to follow up very quickly on that, I mean, one of the things that I think is fascinating about science fiction is that so much of science fiction is us modeling our current anxieties. I mean, and this has been the case for years and years. When we were worried about nuclear annihilation, we had Road Warrior, we had On the Beach, we had all these films that talked about what it was like to live in that post-Holocaust age. One of the reasons I suspect a contributing factor for the reason that no one ever pressed that button is because we had so many books and films and everything else modeling this horrible, terrible world that existed after we dropped the bomb. It was our way of running simulations on a mass entertainment scale, which is, again, how you slip that underneath the door. So when you write The Water Knife, or when you write California, or when you write anything that is about, what is it like at the end of days because we fucked up. Sorry, that's being recorded for television. What it is it allows us a sort of space to experience that without feeling like whoever we are, is necessarily specifically being blamed, but we still get to see what the consequences are.
And that was part of my next question, which I can just throw out there to everybody, is why dystopian and post-apocalyptic fiction is so popular right now. What is driving that desire for it? And especially I notice it a lot in young adult fiction where it's really taken over the genre. But anybody who has any thoughts on...
Well...
I've got some thoughts, or I've got some criticisms anyway. One of the things I think in young adult fiction, honestly, most of this dystopian stuff, I think, is just there for thrills and chills. There are some notable exceptions, things like M.T. Anderson's Feed. There are a few others, but mostly you create a terrible society so that, there's kids can feel a sense of empowerment when they overthrow it, which is fun. It's a great story, but it's not actually, I don't think it's a meaningful story per se in terms of, or even telling us much about our anxieties as a society. I think it might be talking somewhat to exactly how locked down and out and without power kids feel. And so getting to experience a story where they actually get to turn over the government is a cathartic thing for somebody who's locked into an entire system of going to school, applying for your college, going to college, being stuck in these sort of chains of life. But I don't think it's meaningful in the larger sense. But there's something about the function of apocalypses that I kind of wanted to talk briefly about, and particularly myths that we create about bad futures. And one thing that's really interesting to me is like when you look at like the apocalyptic futures, particularly, where a bioapocalypse looks a lot like a plague, looks a lot like a nuclear apocalypse, looks a lot like a food apocalypse, or whatever the thing is, a drought apocalypse. And mostly it's just, it's rendered as this sort of, blank space where bad people do bad things to people, like Road Warrior. Oh, yeah. You sort of pause and you sort of look at that and you say, what is this? And it doesn't seem to be connected to almost anything except for that maybe we don't like our neighbors and we wish there were fewer of them or something. The zombie apocalypse. I get to shoot my neighbor now. He was a zombie anyway. He didn't feel it, really. And I didn't like him, and I didn't like the way he kept his lawn. But the thing is I feel like those myths that we build about how things fall apart are really powerful, and sometimes you see people living into that. I see that in stuff like Preppers, where they're like, oh yeah, the way this goes down is we all hunker down with our guns, get ready. and which is a terrible response to apocalypse. It's not really a successful human response to apocalypse. Humans survive by working together, not by hunkering down with our guns and distrusting each other and shooting at each other. When I was in Japan last year, I had a chance to visit Fukushima and talk to some of the people who organized relief efforts there. And this one person at a university, they were taking in all these people who were refugees from around the Fukushima plant and its environments, and from the typhoon, or I mean the flooding. And he started talking, he's like, yeah, well, so we had all these people in this giant gymnasium, and we realized people needed personal space. So we started building these cardboard sort of walls around different sections so everybody could have a little room for themselves. But then we realized that people needed common areas too, where they could get together and they could kind of drink tea. So we built some of those. And then we realized that really people, don't really like taking charity, so we decided that what we'd do is have everybody cooperate to make meals, and everybody did something to make meals so you could feel like you were involved in the entire process of taking care of each other. And he's like, and then we realized that everybody brought pets, and we really needed to take care of the pets. And by the end of it, he's described this entire chain of rebuilding society inside of this gymnasium, essentially. And the thing you think is, like, this is the myth of an apocalypse that I want. Like, this one where we all get together and we get organized and we take care of each other. And that is sort of the distressing thing about these, the dystopian or broken or apocalyptic futures, is that oftentimes we seem to have, particularly in America, one version of that, which is bust out the guns because the bad guys are coming over the hill.
Zadie Smith I heard her talking on the radio once, and she talked about how fiction provides, I love this, just how it sounds, it's like a little dance, a hypothetical ethical arena. And you're sort of talking that on a larger scale. So, but it could work for any kind of fiction, like, what would I do if my husband came home and said he had another child with another woman? What would I do if the world ended and I only had an onion to protect myself? And you sort of get to see what, I don't know where those two examples came from.
About that.
Make people cry. But what I've noticed in a lot of the speculative or post, whatever word you want to use lately, is this sort of the strain of hope that's there. So the road is really deeply, deeply dark. But I think one reason why people were really connecting to it is that it's really a story about a parent and his child, and that love that persists, and it has this light at its center despite cannibals and charred trees and all of that all around it. And if you look at the popularity of, like, Station 11, she actually sets her novel 20 years after the plague has happened. So the gun showdowns have happened off. She leaves that out of the story. Yeah. And what she's interested in is sort of how people create societies. And I think that blank slate is really appealing to us as people. And it was appealing to me as a writer, thinking about, well, what would the opportunities be if you could really start over? And what horrors would there be if the people who got to start over actually just made some really poor decisions and decided to oppress some of the people? Like, that was what was scary and dramatic for me as the writer.
Yeah.
Well, I can honestly say that dystopian fiction has never been big in Finland. But yeah, it's the Nordic way, Anyway, to get back to, I wrote the book in 2008, 2009. It was published in Finland in 2010. Nobody had ever heard of dystopian fiction. But luckily it caught on later on, and 5 years later I'm in the US talking about it. I think what has happened in Europe as far as awareness of climate change, what has happened is that I think about 10 years ago, maybe 7 years ago even, there was a lot more talk about it. It was daily, you could read in newspapers some kind of an article about climate change or anything. And I think that, because it sort of didn't happen yet, so people sort of started thinking that, well, maybe things aren't that bad at all. Because it's not happening, and maybe we sort of we were just misled, or we misunderstood something. But as far as dystopian fiction, I like what John said about simulating possible futures. I think it has certain truth to it. I think it's in that way, to get back to the first question, I think in that way it is a bit educational. So yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about the process of world building and establishing your setting? Where do you start? What resources did you use? How does it? Yeah, where does it start from? Anybody?
Start. Because you got the.
Do the world building thing.
Yeah.
So with world building, typically there's some specific things that I'm thinking about. So with something like the water knife, I start actually with theme. So I know that I'm writing about drought. I'm writing about climate change, drought, scarcity, stuff like that. So in the world building process, you're thinking about the plot, the characters, and then their physical surroundings, all intertwining, sort of. So, who's the character going to be? It's going to be Maria Villarosa, and she's a climate refugee. She's fled from Texas, and which has already been wiped out. So immediately, this generates history. It generates a character who's got stakes, but her character in itself is already part of the world. But then, you're also looking at, and then, you're sort of doing that with every single character that you're working with. One of the characters in my book is a water knife, and so that means that he's sort of an agent for Las Vegas. He's sort of the 007 of water. And so he goes out and gives people offers on their water rights they can't refuse. He blows up other people's water treatment plants. And he's on the hunt for some new water rights, basically, in this story. And so you have those kinds of things where you're tying this big thematic element down into characters' personal lives and then down into their daily activities. But then you're also looking for these other opportunities to sort of re-emphasize what this world is like or how it's changed. So, Lucy, one of the other characters is a journalist, and when she goes out into a giant dust storm, she puts on a dust mask but it's branded, it's REI, it's Desert Adventure Pro, like it's sort of the apocalypse will be accessorized, that kind of thing. And each one of those little bits that you create sort of makes it, and that the characters treat absolutely as normal, makes your world feel lived in and real. So, there's a point where people are using these clear sacks, which are water filtration devices. You pee in them, you squeeze them, and then you get fresh water, and it filters out all the impurities. Of course, these are only they're like 10 uses, and then they're done, kind of. So then people are throwing them away. So they're blowing around, and they're getting hung up in the saguaros, and so you see this this thing that emphasizes a couple of different layers of what's going on. There's no trash collection anymore. Okay, so that's why they're blowing around. So it tells you something about the city. It tells you about scarcity because people are using them in the first place. And so you're looking for as many different echoes as you can to re-emphasize and sort of make that world feel very close and claustrophobic in a way in terms of the ideas that you're working with.
No, I agree with that. I mean, one of the things that it's much more interesting for me as a writer to write about a world where the world-changing event has already happened than to necessarily write about the world, doing the origin story. I'm going to leave that to the superhero movies. And it's much more interesting for like Lock-In to do 25 years after the plague, Station 11, 20 years after, whatever happened. And and I think you make a very good point of, you don't show people like looking at the stuff that they're using as anything other than this is your day-to-day life. In my book, people, 1 person out of 100 is represented in day-to-day life by an android, basically, because that they use to walk around because their bodies are not functional. And the very first time that someone sees something like that, it'd be like, it's amazing, you're an android, and yet you are walking around. And then 25 years later, it's like, oh, hi. Where's that report? Right? Because you get used to the technology. I always use, these things are miracles. These are fucking miracles, right? Everything that these things do, if I went back to 12-year-old me and said, you will have a computer that has access to everything. You will carry it around. You can speak to it and it will speak back. And I would be looking up at future me, one going, where's your hair? And then the second thing, are you a wizard? And that's pretty much the way. But we don't ever think about it. The way you know that technology, that you live in the future, is not that you're aware that you have this amazing piece of technology that does fantastic things. It is that you have this amazing technology that does amazing things, and you're pissed off when it doesn't work exactly the way it's supposed to. Why do I have to answer? It's like, why do I have to, Siri, why do I have to talk to you twice, right? And so that is a much more interesting world. And so you do a whole bunch of world building that is not actually going to be in the book, because if you actually have to be that sort of writer who has to show off every shiny thing, I think to Paolo's point, you are more, you're a show-off, you're not a storyteller. You're a show-off.
Show up. When I started writing my book, I just started writing it like I would write anything. And later people were like, how did you decide on the ways that the world would end? I was like, well, it's obvious, you guys, how the world's going to end. There's climate change, the rich are getting everything in my book sort of reflects everything that I am anxious about today. Yeah. And that was just sort of a given when I started writing. I didn't sit down and create the world. But I also just started with a scene. I actually started the first scene in my book is based on an exercise I did with my students, which was, this is a great exercise, you guys. Have your character in a room with a possession that nobody else knows they possess. So I had my character, Frida. I knew I was going to write about these characters living out in the woods after LA's kind of collapsed and civilization is kind of broken down. And I was like, well, now she has a turkey baster. Why the fuck does she have a turkey baster?
Why wouldn't you have a turkey baster?
But she was really treasuring the turkey baster, so I was like, oh, okay, so in a world where you can't have anything new, what you end up having is really special to you. So if you had this cup, it was your little toy, you would love this cup dearly. And I started just focusing, what's in the room? Where does she live? I remember thinking, what does she smell like? Oh my God, what does she smell like? Oh my God, their feet must smell so badly. And I just started with the human element. Of course, later I got in big trouble and had to do a lot of expository exercises to figure out, the origins of my terrorist group that I had created just for fun in the middle of a scene, which I don't recommend doing. But then again, I really just was really trying to inhabit character perspective, like you guys have said, and make their day-to-day life normal to them. And it was really fun also to destroy, I had a suicide bomber at the Hollywood and Highland Mall in LA. And LA is a city I love, but the Hollywood and Highland Mall, you could blow it up and I would rejoice. I hope nobody gets hurt. But so I got to blow up the mall, and that was really pleasing, and I got to do things that I never get to do in other kinds of fiction.
Yeah. I agree with a lot that has been said. But I've now written 5 books, and they've all been very different from one another. And the healer that I'm supposedly talking about today is my only dystopia. But what I found, I do a lot of research for every book. And what I like about research is that once you start writing, you leave it all behind. You sort of start after the fact. You sort of, I think it was Elmer Leonard whose advice on writing was that you have to write a scene where you start as late as possible. You enter the scene as late as possible, and I think that works for an entire book. And really, you start. You know the facts. You know everything that has happened. But then you arrive late, and you just start, with your people and characters in the book, and they just live their day-to-day life, and to them that's the new normal. Yeah.
So, are you able to write about a future with any kind of optimism, or how do you write about climate change and other intense subjects without becoming overwhelmed by them?
I think it's pretty easy to write optimistically. The thing is that you do understand that change is coming, change is happening, change is not necessarily always a horrible thing. There are going to be difficult days. But the thing about any event is a dramatic thing happens or some horrible thing happens. The world changes, the world adjusts. There is a new normal, and people go along with their lives. As long as you're not really literally killing 90% of the people or something like that, then there's going to be some way to move forward with that. So I don't really have a problem. And I don't know that optimism is the right word, but I think it's easy to create a world where there is a new normal where you can have joy and happiness and along with the more negative things. And ultimately, at the end of the days, you know what? If we really screw up the earth, it's not that we've screwed up the earth, we've screwed up the earth for us. The earth is going to be fine without us. You know what I mean? It's going to be, yeah, there was this one time I had this really bad rash, but then it went away and I was fine. That's the earth after humans. So, you know, we're the rash. You know, what we want to do is find a way that we, you know, subside and actually learn to live coterminously with the world. And if we can do that, then all options, you know, optimistic and pessimistic, are open. If we can't, then we had our shot. It was nice for us, and I'm really excited for our squid overlords. You know I'm right.
All right, I'll do this. So I have a really hard time writing optimistic books. I only wrote one that was ever really a joy, and that was Zombie Baseball Beatdown, so, which was great fun. It was such a wonderful escape from the book that I was working on at the time. But what I have found is that I can't really write an optimistic future exactly, because I don't think it's an earned thing. Like I'm not seeing any, you know, we're you know, the Lake Mead is at an all-time low, and our the carbon in the atmosphere is at an all-time high. So that doesn't really feel like, you know, we're going in the right directions exactly. So when it feels like we start earning a future that seems more positive, I'll definitely write that future. But one thing I have been able to do is that I have written stories where the world is devastated because of our decisions, but that doesn't necessarily mean that a character in the future can't have a win. And there is something really interesting about optimism, and Neil Stephenson talks a little bit about this, the power of myth and the power of science fiction to create positive myths that we want to live into. And in Shipbreaker, which is a book I wrote for young adults, I really did want to have some positive ideas out there. I think science fiction has this amazing power to inspire people to move towards a better future, and if you put the right marker out there, hopefully they'll go in that direction. And so one of the things in Shipbreaker is that it's an oil depleted, resource scarce society, but there's a new age of sail going on where people have built these amazing new clipper ships. They have hydrofoils, they have high altitude parasails. These ships are fast and they're sleek, and there is still a global economy, but it's based on wind. And I was really interested in the idea of making sustainable technologies look exciting, look sexy, look fun, look amazing, look adventurous. And very much you want to sort of put those markers out there, and in that way you can sort of be optimistic even if the world is broken. It's a shattered global warming world, but boy, those ships are cool, and wouldn't it be great if somebody actually thought about building more sailing ships like those? So.
Where do I begin? On the one hand, writing California was cathartic for me, and it was really just fun, and it was sort of pleasing to be in such a horrible world at times. And I really loved the dramatic propulsion that such high stakes gave me. I was like, oh my God, it's the underworld. Stuff is happening here. So on a sort of day-to-day creative...
Welcome to genre.
I know. Yes. I don't just have people talking in rooms. Thank God. So in a day-to-day sort of creative life, I found it really enjoyable, and I liked the aesthetic challenge of if this happened, then this happened. If this happened, then this happened. But in reality, now I'm writing a book of realism, or whatever you want to call it. It doesn't have any science in it. And it's the same. It's if this happened, then how would this happen? If this happened, then this happened. And it's really dark, so I don't think I can really escape that, whether it's taking place in the future or the present. But I tend to be one of those people, and I think it's reflected in my fiction, that I'm pretty cynical. I remember I was in a book club and we talked about Freedom by Jonathan Franzen, and I was pregnant at the time, but nobody knew, and I went on this diatribe about how we were ruining the earth and nobody should have children and blah, 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 and there was a long pause, and one woman was like, so I guess you're never becoming a mother. And I was like, oh God, I am. What does that mean? So I tend to think that we're all screwed in many ways, and we sort of inherit the earth that we have created. But at the same time, every day, I'm sure it's all the same for you, that you come across people who are really lovely, kind, compassionate, innovative people, and that that exists alongside all of our collective greed and everything else we've done, and I think that's really fascinating to me. So I think that's present in all my fiction.
I've now written 5 novels that have been all categorized as noir. If you know anything about noir, it's not very optimistic. And I'm not very optimistic about the state of things, of what's going to happen. But at the same time, in my stories, the important themes are always love, what people are ready to do for the people they love, and the sacrifice, and doing something for others. So in that way, I am optimistic. I believe that we have this capacity to do good things. We just don't we don't very often choose to do those things. But yeah, and one thing I was going to say to that previous question was that I really enjoyed writing dystopian book. And I don't know what that says about me.
All you people are depressing. Life is awesome.
Life is awesome.
Yeah.
It's just that the future isn't.
Okay, we have to wrap it up now, but Paolo will be talking about the water knife tomorrow at noon at Freight and Salvage. Antti will be participating in the Nordic Noir panel tomorrow at 3 at the Magnus Museum. Let's have a big hand for Edan, Paolo, John, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Mike.